Hello everyone, welcome to this Unreal Engine 5 how-to video. Today we'll be discussing Landscape Physical Material Output node. There isn't much information available online about this node, so in this video, we'll be taking a closer look at what it does and how to use it. To get started, we'll first need to create the landscape. This can be done by going to the Modes panel, selecting Landscape, and then choosing the desired landscape size and resolution. Once we've created our landscape, we can sculpt it a bit to see the changes. This can be done using the Sculpt tools in the Modes panel. We can adjust the terrain height, smooth out rough edges, and add in any additional features we'd like. After we've sculpted our landscape, we can begin creating a simple layer blend material that will allow us to paint different textures onto different zones of the landscape. To do this, we'll first need to create a new material in the Content browser by right-clicking and selecting Material. Once we have our new material, we can begin building our color. We'll add color nodes for each layer. We can create new colors by pressing the 4 inches key, which will bring up a color picker. We can then add a Landscape Layer Blend node. In the node, we'll add an option for each color we created. Then we'll connect each color node to its corresponding color option in the Landscape Layer Blend node. Finally, we'll connect the output of the Landscape Layer Blend node to the material's base color input. Now that we have our landscape material set up, we can add our material to the landscape. To do this, we'll need to select our material in the Content browser. Then select the landscape in the Level editor. With the landscape selected, we'll open up the Details panel on the right-hand side of the screen and navigate to the Materials section. From there, we'll click the Add button and select our material from the list. Now that we have our color blend material set up, we can open up the Landscape tool and create a new weight blend layer for each of our color layers. To do this, we'll click on the Paint tab in the Landscape tool and then click the Add Layer button under Weight Layers. Next, we'll clear all the layers from the landscape and assign the water layer to the entire landscape. This will allow us to paint our layers onto the landscape without any interference from existing layers. Using the brush tool and selecting the layer we want to paint with, we can start painting the landscape with our desired colors. We can add grass and dirt layers to the landscape and make it look the way we want. Now that we have our landscape painted with our desired colors and layers, we can add physics properties to each layer using the Landscape Physical Material Output node. To do this, we'll open up the material we created earlier and add the Landscape Physical Material Output node. In the node, we'll add an option for each of our color layers and assign the physics material we want to apply to each layer. Next, we'll create a layer sample node for each of the color layers we created earlier and call it the same name as the layer. We'll then connect each of the layer samples to the corresponding input on the Landscape Physical Material Output node. Now let's see the result. As you can see, the Landscape Physical Material Output node has allowed us to apply physics properties to each layer we painted onto the landscape, creating a more realistic and dynamic environment. Now let's take a look at how we can apply a Landscape Physical Material Output node to an auto material, which will not be painted manually, but instead will be generated based on the landscape height. While we didn't go into the details of creating the auto material in this video, I will attach a link to the full 3-hour-long course on how to create an auto material, a video from CG Dealer's YouTube channel. Now let's dive deeper into the Landscape Physical Material Output node. This node allows us to automatically generate surface physics based on the height of our landscape, making it much easier to create a realistic and dynamic environment. Inside our auto material, we created a procedural section that allows us to automatically generate objects on the layers. To enable physics for each layer, we'll copy the entire procedural section, including the slope information of each layer. Then, we'll paste it again and modify it to create the physics section. For the static switches, we'll change the name from procedural to physics, and add a new static switch for the water layer. For the water layer, we will add the named reroute we created in the auto material called Water Mask R. With the static switches set up, we can now enable and disable the physics for each layer as needed. Then we can delete the Landscape Grass node from our material and replace it with the Landscape Physical Material Output node. This will allow us to automatically generate surface physics based on the height of our landscape for each layer, instead of grass. Once we have the Landscape Physical Material Output node added to our material, we'll need to choose a physics material for each layer, and connect the input from the node to the static switch output for each layer. In addition to using the Landscape Physical Material Output node to add physics to our auto material, we can also use weight blend layers to remove foliage and physics from specific locations on the landscape. To do this, we'll first add a new weight blend layer for our Remove Foliage layer. We'll then paint this layer in the areas where we want to remove foliage and physics. And with that, we're done with our material setup. By using the Landscape Physical Material Output node, we were able to automatically apply physics to each layer without having to paint it manually. We can now test our material by launching our game in the Unreal Engine editor and moving our character around the landscape. As we move around, we'll see the different physics properties we assign to each layer in action. Enjoy and keep being creative.